Oh, well, welcome back. It's my pleasure to start the second session of the Climate Justice Panel by welcoming Professor José Alvarez. Professor Alvarez has a biography that is far too long for me to read in full, but he is currently the Herbert and Rose Rubin Professor of International Law at New York University School of Law and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So with that introduction, I will leave you in his safe hands.
Great. Can you hear me?
You can.
And what about my slides? I can't do anything without them.
We can see those.
Great. So thank you so much for the invitation. Unfortunately, it's so early that I have not been able to attend the other session, so I'm hoping I don't repeat anything anybody has said. But I'll just launch in because I know I have limited time. So I suspect everyone in this room knows what you're watching up here. These are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, including 169 targets, over 200 indicators of success. And of course, given the theme of just transitions, at least, number 6, number 7, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 here on this slide all relate directly to the environment, but a lot of the other targets, goals, and indicators crisscross all of them, so that, for example, you can pick gender equality, and it recognizes that economic empowerment of women would massively contribute to leaving no one behind, including with respect to the devastating impact of climate change, so that it includes indicators that suggest that you have to address the economic precarity of women, given the disproportionate impact they face as water carriers, principal caregivers, users of coal-fired indoor stoves, and of course, all sorts of issues as they engage in migration because of disasters. And that's just an indicator of the huge importance, not just, of course, to gender equality, to all the goals, but the crisscrossing of all of them. So I will now try to move into my next slide, if I can figure out how to do that. Let's see. So what I'm trying to do is to relate the SDG exercise, which you all know and love, to what many people regard as its monster. That is, the SDGs, in many people's views, were designed to actually respond to the international investment regime, that is, the globalization of trade and capital, which, in the view of many people, has encouraged massive amount of industrialization with all the negative externalities that ensues. So one way of thinking about this depiction here of some 2,600 bilateral and multilateral international investment agreements is as a response to the Washington Consensus model that basically this enables. So the SDGs, in the words of somebody like David Boyd, UN Special Rapporteur for the Environment, from his 2022 report, is really a response to this. And so here on the left-hand side, you see the many investment agreements that provide protection, especially at the beginning, to Western exporters of capital, guarantees of non-discrimination, fair and equitable treatment, the right to compensation for a taking of their property, to try to encourage them to invest abroad safely. And of course, that regime is supplemented by investor-state dispute settlement, whereby those investors can, in effect, sue in arbitration the host states. And here in the slide, you see a modest amount of green, basically agreements. Those are the reformed international investment agreements of, say, the past 15 or so years that purport to be in favor of sustainable development and try to insert that goal into the investor regime so that they would actually rebalance the treaties to provide a little fewer rights to the investor and greater rights to regulate to the host state. On the right-hand side, you see the perception of what these are. That is, these are two hydra-headed monsters, with apologies to William Blake. The first one is the investment treaties themselves, and the bottom monster is the way they are enforced, the international investor state dispute settlement mechanism. And as David Boyd suggests in his latest report, one easy way to improve the prospects of the SDGs, including a just transition, is to simply terminate either the top monster by killing off all of these investment treaties, or at least killing off the bottom one, make them less enforceable through arbitration, because after all, that's the format where a huge number of damages have been faced by host states, principally lesser developed countries, who have been forced to pay for their environmental regulations that are perceived to violate the rights of investors. So that's the dilemma we face, is that most people think these two global regimes, the SDGs and their efforts to enable us to have a clean, healthy environment, are totally at odds with the international investment regime. And I would like to suggest that if we totally rethink how we deal with international investment agreements, they may become, and this is a far distant political proposal, I understand, much more compatible with each other. So this slide suggests the current policy options. As I said, we terminate the treaties. We amend them to safeguard their rights to regulate. Or we do the same thing, preserve the right to regulate, including for environmental, by narrowing the rights accorded to foreign investors. And we introduce special and differential treatment to enable even greater rights to regulate to lesser developed countries. You can see that recipe book all over the UN, especially in UNCTAD's investment policy framework for sustainable development. I'm not making this stuff up. This is exactly what people think is the way to make these two things a bit more compatible. The problem, as I see it, is that all this would do is to make the international investment agreement slightly less incompatible, but not actually contribute to the chief problem, or one of the main problems. As we all know, the SDGs are in deep trouble. And the reason they're in deep trouble is because they're an unfunded mandate. We are telling countries to do all these things, but all of these things cost a lot of money to do. And where is the money supposed to be coming from? The dilemma is quite clear. If you look at this granted 2014 report from UNCTAD, the numbers have only increased, but you get the picture. If you go down, climate change mitigation, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down. The current investment at that time anyway was 170 billion per year towards climate change mitigation, whereas the real number that you would need is somewhere between 550 and 850 billion dollars, leaving a gap, an investment gap of between 380 and 680. It doesn't take much math skills to figure that out. And a good chunk of that gap is by private market actors, because let's face it, the international financial institutions, the World Bank, and the national AID institutions, like the one in the US, are not going to provide for that kind of money. Nobody anticipates that. It has to come at least partly from private market investments in order to do climate change or climate change adaptation, or, as you see down, health and education. The gaps are quite huge. I would just briefly note that with respect to developed countries, the very last one, the gap is a bit less because they get far more in terms of private sector participation in current investment. So if you look at climate change mitigation, they get some $90 billion of private funding to contribute to this, whereas the developing countries get only 40. And what this results, just to get to the bottom line, is in 2023, UNCTAD updated its data and showed that whereas in 2014, the gap was $1.5 trillion to fulfill the SDGs in developing countries due to all sorts of horrors that we all know: COVID, economic crises, wars, in 2023, that investment gap for developing countries is over $4 trillion. So where's that money going to come from? Unfortunately, most of the people engaged in both the SDGs and in the international investment agreements or the investment regimes modification have not squarely addressed this. To his credit, David Boyd in his report has, and he suggests many good ideas, but most of them are politically unlikely. A global tax on wealth, we know carbon tax, all sorts of issues to try to cover this investment gap. But he does acknowledge one of them that I do share is a little less politically unlikely, although very hard to do, which is we currently spend, and this includes both developing and other states, $1.8 trillion in subsidies of one kind or another to harmful industries, including fossil fuels. And he proposes that that's a waste of money, and I totally agree. And so at least $1.8 trillion of those subsidies could go to green energy. And that, I think, is part of the solution that I'm suggesting. That is, the one regime that we have out here in international law land to increase the investment in developing countries are the international investment agreements. Now, I won't get into, but in my paper that I'm happy to share, I suggest many reasons why those investment agreements can actually do that, despite evidence that in some cases they have not. But the point is, why waste the regime, or why waste time reforming the regime that won't actually contribute to filling this investment gap? And so what I'm proposing, and I have to be very brief here, is that we actually try to reform, and I mean really reform, the international investment agreements so that they are genuinely green. That is, we use them to enforce states' duties to regulate on behalf of many of the SDGs, but for purposes of this conference, safe, clean, and healthy environment, which cuts across many of them, as I've mentioned. And so the reconception here is that both the host states of FDI, as well as the capital exporters of foreign investment, that is, the wealthy countries, both have duties to regulate, and that they exist under existing treaties, not these, but human rights treaties that provide, that basically say you have a duty to provide food, adequate health, adequate shelter. And those treaty obligations should be how we rethink the SDGs. The SDGs are not just policy instruments, as David Boyd's own report indicates. The origin of them is that they reflect existing treaty obligations that states have, not just under human rights, but under environmental treaties. And so if those duties to regulate is really the key here, not just expanding the right to regulate, this slide indicates some of the things that these investment or SDG-friendly investment agreements would look like. They would establish national and international green investment promotion agencies that would condition the entry of foreign investment and its expansion on SDG impact statements in the environment, be environmental impact statements. With respect to gender, it would be gender impact statements. They would ensure, among other things, government conditions on investor rights that are in good faith applications of their duty to regulate. You would replace the old restrictions in these treaties on performance requirements with SDG targeted investment promotion. That is, you would have friendly policies towards green energy, for instance, that would be accomplished through instrumental investment screening, performance requirements that would extract tech transfer on green energy, local employment, local contact, subsidized infrastructure services, market preferences, public procurement policies, other financial incentives. That 1.8 trillion that is now going to bad stuff would go to green stuff, let's put it in the simplest ways. And you will use those investment agencies created by these treaties to assess, modify government policies for both the exporters of capital and those who take them in based on social, environmental, development impact statements, but also their effectiveness over time, new technology. So this envisions a continuous revisal of the policies that would be most effective to bring in the types of investors, cover that huge investment gap that you need to fill the SDGs. Notice that the last one includes encouraging both the home states of FDI to provide incentives for their outbound investors to invest in the proper industries and require the outward bound investments to adhere to their extraterritorial obligations imposed on human rights treaties. In other words, what has been ignored is the fact that many of the human rights treaties in particular say to states, you have a duty to do these things when your investors invest abroad, and you have a duty to regulate those investors when they invest abroad to adhere to, for example, gender equality, environmental protection, and so forth. And you would require, or if you can't, at least encourage technical assistance to facilitate implementation of this kind of investment promotion. And here, since I mentioned gender equality at the outset, I want to say that at least some of these things are not as expensive as others. And make no mistake, it does take money to make sure that you respect women. It takes money to enforce protection orders. It takes money to make sure your courts respect gender equality, as well as your police officers, for instance. But it is a relatively lower cost option to many of the others. And if you did this one step, all the data suggests you would do a great deal to fulfill and help improve the outcomes for the rest of the SDGs. If you treat women equally to men, and I mean substantively equally, not just formally, then all the other SDGs improve. And here's how you would think about putting gender, re-engendering these investment treaties. You would put in place methods to make sure, which is already required under the Convention for Equality for Women, data gathering that would help us see what is it that you're doing in terms of encouraging investment and what is the impact of that investment on gender equality. Of course, you would ensure domestic laws, regulations, and practices with respect to property, access to women to credit, contract. All these things respect substantive equality and are not just formally gender neutral under your law. You would correct, as CEDAW does, insist on your social, cultural, and religious practices that adversely impact on women's economic empowerment. And this would be part of your investment protection agreements. And notice that these are obligations not just on the investors, but actually on the states themselves to enforce the very same obligations that they have already assumed by joining under CEDAW. What it does by bringing it into here is to bring it into economic terms and in treaties that at least traditionally have been far more forceful in terms of, yes, securing enforcement on their terms. So I'm not going to go through all of these because I know I'm running out of time. But these are some of the re-engendering of investment agreements that I think if you just put your mind to it, you can find. By the way, some of this is already reflected in the rhetoric, not so much the practice of the World Bank, which has guidelines on what, for example, a gender equality investment promotion agency would look like. That would include, for example, the participation of women in that agency and also the reduction of corruption. Because it turns out that if you look at the data, when you have these investment promotion agencies in many countries, they inordinately discriminate against women by asking from them, women entrepreneurs and others, for bribes because they are perceived as vulnerable. And so you'd have to correct a lot of things to make sure the investment promotion agencies actually empower, not disempower, women entrepreneurs. The summary of the argument is here. we've had a lot of experience since 1959 with these treaties. Some of them, in my view, do encourage investment, but much of that investment has, I agree with David Boyd, had negative externalities, and certainly the consequences of enforcing only rights on investment with no discrimination between any investor, whether they're fossil fuels or otherwise, has created a real dilemma. I think it is part of the problem that we've had these treaties. And the logic originally was, and you all remember this, is if you free the market will lift all boats. So keep the government out of regulation, privatize everything, respect the property rights of foreign investors, and you will secure economic development. Well, that didn't work out so well. But what I'm also predicting is that the reformed treaties, those little green ones in that slide, will also not do well, because all you're doing is saying, okay, the market didn't do it. Let's just leave it up to state discretion to do, because they all, after all, have the right to regulate. And we'll ignore that they really have a considerable amount of duties to regulate to fulfill the SDGs. And so my course correction on the investment agreements is that neither the turn to free markets nor unrestricted states, and hoping that they all do what's in their best interest, will achieve filling up the sustainable investment gap of funding. So that's, in essence, my argument. I have an additional slide that talks about, I'm not stupid. This is a lot of political difficulties to try to get to where I'm going. And among those is the fact that my government and the US has decided on a bipartisan basis that they're no longer interested in either the WTO trade agreements or investment agreements at all. Not for the reasons David Boyd would point out, but simply for protectionist reasons. We want to keep the jobs in the United States. So that's a huge hurdle to overcome. My modest hope is that if we start rethinking what these treaties are for, that these treaties are for green investment, for example, it would change the dynamics of who supports these treaties, the types of business entities, but also the types of NGOs that would not simply say, let's kill them all off and hope for the best that somehow a global carbon tax will fill the need for financing development, but also change the way we go forward in terms of encouraging the right kind of investment. Thank you for your attention.